And again, no Mr. Big Voice joining me this morning. He's on vacation this week by the looks of things. So cold open, Bill Colley with you this morning on News Radio 1310 KLIX and newsradio1310.com. I'll take the extra minute. 77 minutes normally is the total talk time of Top Story. And some days I feel I could be doing it for several more hours. So I'm going to explain to you right now, I am not at all upset about having one extra minute. That sometimes can make all the difference in the world when I'm trying to make an argument about a particular point. We have a great deal going on during the course of the program today in that 77 minutes and the 2 hours. First of all, Steve Millington will be joining us coming up in just about 20 minutes. He is with the Twin Falls Republican Party, the chairman, in fact, of that organization. And in 1 hour, a little under 1 hour now, Benjamin Netanyahu will be addressing a joint session of the U.S. Congress, although the boycott by Democrats has been growing. Other people, on the other hand, are more than willing to take their seats. So that's on the way. That will be taking place during the course of the final hour of our show. And number three, a couple of things that I happened to see this morning that I wanted to just sort of address quickly as we open the program. This was a topic we had for discussion a couple of weeks ago on the show, and it drew a lot of commentary from people who were either guests on the program or callers who were chiming in during the course of the show. And what I have is a couple of quick notes and about gun rights, your Second Amendment rights. First of all, this popped up on the Associated Press after a sheriff in northern Idaho gave an interview to a newspaper, and he is sort of the counterweight to some other law enforcers who aren't sure that this is really a good idea. A northern Idaho sheriff says he supports allowing residents to carry concealed weapons without needing a permit. Bonner County Sheriff Darrell Wheeler tells the Bonner County Daily Bee in a story on Sunday that the constitutional carry bill introduced by lawmakers last month aligns Idaho law with the true meaning of the Second Amendment to the U.S. Constitution. Now, as you know, we've already had people who've been opposed. In some other counties, some sheriffs don't like the idea of doing this. And in the city of Pocatello, the police chief as well has said he would not be going along with such an idea, or certainly not supporting it, and would likely put his 2 cents in when it comes to a legislative decision. I sent that to a friend of mine this morning just to get some feedback, and he's a constitutionalist. And he wrote back and he said, nowhere in the Second Amendment do I see any reference to permits. And that is where the argument seems to lie. And while I do believe people need some training if they're going to be owning and operating a firearm, you don't necessarily, according to the Constitution, have to have anybody standing there over you saying, all right, you have now passed. I will give you a slip of paper that gives you permission to carry, a concealed carry permit. So we have this going on right now in the state of Idaho. I don't think it's going to pass. I really do believe that the legislators who support it and give it a lot of lip service will back off at the last minute because they'll be concerned about the dangers it could pose to other people or even law enforcers. Look, if we stripped the Constitution entirely and we lived in some sort of police state, as they do in North Korea, it would make life a lot safer for a great many other people. But when you live in a country where you are supposedly guaranteed liberty by God and not the government, you do have to take some chances. And that's been my view on this for quite some time. 10 minutes after 8 o'clock, Bill Colley with you on Top Story. Right now we're looking at a temperature of 28, and we are hoping it's going to get warmer today, maybe another 20 degrees before we finish up. Some beautiful weather coming at the end of the week. Absolutely beautiful. We may be into the 60s by the time we get to this weekend, and along with plenty of sunshine. So, still talking about firearms, if we could, for just a moment on the program. And you're listening to News Radio 1310 KLIX, and also newsradio1310.com if you're listening online. And you can also reach the program today by dialing 736-0300, or drop me an email at bill.colley@townsquaremedia.com. That last name is spelled Colley. I came across this yesterday. You have likely heard, if you are a gun enthusiast, you have heard about the so-called executive order that the president will put into effect. And you've got to ask yourself, are executive orders even constitutional themselves? And I think because of the great number of them we are now seeing with the president ruling by fiat, I would argue that you're likely going to see several court challenges to these executive orders in the next couple of years. Dave Boyer, writing in the Washington Times, I pulled this down just before I left work yesterday, happened to see it in my email. The White House said yesterday that President Obama believes a ban on bullets commonly used with the AR-15 rifle will save police officers' lives. And it always comes down to that. Well, there's a public good in our decision. So we're always selling people on the public good. We're not talking Constitution here. We're just talking, well, there's a public good. Well, there are a lot of public goods out there that we don't pay any attention to. If you really want to save lives, stop us all from driving or eating certain foods. Well, I guess they're trying that in some big cities around the country. But that's how it's always sold. It's a public good. And if we just do this, and you'll hear that argument, well, if we save just one life, friends, if we also end up restraining ourselves and putting ourselves into one large prison called the Great USA, then I don't know that that really is a public good in the long run. House lawmakers from both parties, as well as sportsmen and some law enforcement officials, are objecting to the move. More than 100 members of Congress have signed a letter opposing the move on ammo. You see, if they can't take away your guns, they can take away your bullets. And that seems to be the objective. They cannot come. Pat Buchanan said something on the McLaughlin group a couple of months ago. I happened to be watching it. I know. I lead a very exciting life. Pat Buchanan said, you have more guns in this country than you have people. So we may be approaching gun ownership where we have a total of 400 million guns. Maybe not quite that many, but it's getting close. 400 million guns in private hands in this country. The government simply could not collect all of those, even if it wanted to. It could, on the other hand, shut down all of your grocery stores and make sure the trucks don't get there through some executive order. I realize this is a far-out notion, and we hear this and people say, oh, now you're just going down the Alex Jones highway. But if you wanted to do it, and government wanted to do it, and it was serious about removing firearms, what they could do is they could shut down all of the trucks coming and delivering groceries to your stores. And when you're hungry, they could say, tell you what, you bring in your firearms, I'll give you a few loaves of bread. See, that would work. Or number two, they could just simply stop with the ammunition. And this is, I think, the slippery slope. If Mr. Obama, by fiat, ruling as a king, if you will, if he can order that you cannot buy ammunition, one type of ammunition, then he can order, or he will try to order, that you can not buy other types of ammunition. And eventually, you can have all the dang firearms you want. You can stand in your window shouting outside to everyone, Mullen Lobby, come and get them. But you know what? If you don't have anything to put in them, all you're going to be able to do is swing them like a baseball bat, which seems to be the goal of some people in government and a lot of the liberals in this country, the leftists, the Marxist-Leninists who really believe that they have to control everyone else because they're smarter than everyone else. So when I hear the argument being made in Idaho, I'll tell you what, it may strike a lot of people out there as being dangerous, but weigh those other alternatives. Weigh those other alternatives. And I do know a great many people. One of my dad's best friends, he used to make his own ammunition in his basement, and he'd give me occasionally the duds. I may still have those in a closet somewhere with a collection of a lot of my other trinkets from when I was a child. He was an incredible guy. His name was Larry Curtin. And Mr. Curtin, I was once told, from about 1,400 yards, shot a squirrel with a .30-06, and was extremely talented in when it came to the use of firearms. Had been a marksman in the U.S. military. But I think Americans have to realize we are under assault by this fellow. There was a story yesterday that I happened to come across too, published by one of America's leading liberals, and he was talking about his life working in newspapers back about 2005. And he said all the liberals at the time were complaining. They kept telling him, you know what, we have a problem here because President Bush, he's ruling as an unconstitutional executive. That is, he's ruling by fiat. He's ruling as if he were king. And he said, now you're hearing it from the American right that Barack Obama is. And his point being that we have invested so much power in the presidency, which was not intended by our framers, by the people who founded this country, that the presidency has become a very dangerous thing. And it has been that way really since Herbert Hoover. Franklin Roosevelt was the first person to come along and say, you know what? I'm going to use this as my bully pulpit to do whatever I dang well please. And when the courts wouldn't go along, he thought he should pack the court and have 15 Supreme Court justices instead of 9. And he tried everything he could to do an end around so he could rule by what Franklin Roosevelt thought was right and not by what perhaps a majority may have thought was right. And even if they did think it's right, if it's not constitutional, we have to live by that original document. If you'd like to check out the story I'm referencing, the writer's name is Matthew Iglesias, and you can likely find it online if you do a quick computer search. Maybe go to Start Page or some safe method of searching the internet. I'll warn you right now, Google may not be your best friend. So if you go to one of these other search engines, and Matthew's a fairly simple name to spell. I think if you know your Bible, that one's easy. He spells the last name Yglesias. I'm reading that off a computer screen, and I hope I've got it right because I'm looking through a pair of glasses right now that likely I bought these at a discount store in December, and now I regret it. They take away the astigmatism. They don't necessarily help my reading at all. But once more, Matthew Iglesias, if you just go and you search that on the computer and then you check recent stories, I think it's a long read. But by golly, if you are worried about the overreach of the chief executive of this country, and we shouldn't say chief executive, the executive, he is a co-equal branch. He is not the boss of Congress. He is not the boss of the courts. He is a man in a co-equal branch. And I think we've gotten to the point, and Iglesias warns that he thinks American democracy is doomed because of the power that the presidents have developed and they now have in their hands. And he even foreshadows a potential coup at some point. Maybe not against this president, maybe not in the next 10 years, but he says within our lifetimes, a great many of us who will still be alive, we could see something like that happen when a president gets to the point where the president believes that he's indispensable, or she being the one who we should point out. If you have not yet heard this morning, because I'm sure it's getting buried in all of the hoopla about the Netanyahu speech, they're telling you that the poor innocent Virgin Obama is being ravaged by this terrible man from Israel. That's the media narrative, isn't it? So you can ignore the story about Hillary Clinton when she was working as Secretary of State, that she was using her own personal email and not a government email account. Very dangerous thing. Sarah Palin did that while governor of Alaska and was roundly criticized by all of the liberals in media, which means, 99%. Hillary Clinton does it. They'll run with it for a week, but they don't want to mess with her coronation, and then the story will dry up. It's a bit like that story about Lois Lerner's emails, and the fact that we now know that the departed Attorney General Eric Holder actually worked to stop investigators from finding those emails. He ordered a halt to the search for them. All of these details come out. Pay no attention. Follow the distraction the media wants you to follow this week, and they'll tell you that everything's going to be okay. Their guy has got everything under control, and if we would just follow what he believes in, by golly, we'll all be better off. That's what they'd like us to think. Coming up on 20 minutes after 8 o'clock, 28 at our studios. My name is Bill Colley. This is News Radio 1310. That's loud. Either that or my headphones are. News Radio 1310, KLIX. Also online, anywhere around the world, newsradio1310.com. Steve Millington will be joining us in about 10 minutes. I hope you can stick around because I don't want to say that his comments are inflammatory. His comments are spot on, but he doesn't sugarcoat anything. That's on the way. Coming up just in a short while, right here on News Radio 1310 KLIX. We've been telling people the last few weeks here on Top Story about an opportunity if you're looking to make a little extra money around the house. Perhaps you've retired and you find retirement to be not everything you wanted it to be when it comes to excitement in life, and you need a little activity. Or you have someone in the house who's just looking for a second income, perhaps to pay some of the bills. Western States Bus Services is hiring part-time bus drivers right now in split shifts, 5 days per week, summers off, and scheduled no school days. Pay is $10.75 per hour. You can apply today by contacting 733-8003. That is 733-8003. Western States Bus Services is an equal opportunity employer. Hey, I've got a couple of other things just to quickly mention that happened at the state capitol yesterday, and we've had a lot of discussion. Well, legislative session kind of getting down to crunch time now, but here we go again. This is one of my criticisms. Media is not reporting facts any longer and hasn't been for decades. They are advocates. They pick a cause. They see a group they believe happens to be a victim, and then they go out and they fight for what they believe is the victim in that cause. And here we go. This comes from the Idaho Statesman, and it's the story about, now here you go again. You could have 1,000 Tea Partiers demonstrating outside the state capitol, and that would get buried on page B6. I've seen that happen before. I have experienced these things. On the other hand, you get 24 people from a leftist cause who are demonstrating. It's front page news. And here you have a photograph. There were 23 people, gay rights activists they are called. They were arrested yesterday for disrupting state legislature. The add the words issue still on top of mind for all of these people. But there's a photograph here of a state trooper who is in very good shape, we should point out. He looks like he could perhaps break some logs with his bare hands. And he is set to arrest a woman who is standing here with her hand covering her mouth. And, of course, she is much smaller. So the idea is they want to put that into your mind. Here is this big old tough state trooper, and here is this poor little woman who is going to be carted away to jail. Well, they were warned. They were told you could be here, but you got to be quiet. But they weren't quiet. Doesn't matter who you are. If you're disrupting the legislature when they're in session, someone is going to haul you away. That's how it works. 23 people is not a large number. Let's get right to the point of this. But it's a big story. It's one of the lead stories. And there's this huge photograph of the trooper, and he's apparently just warning the woman before the arrest, but it mentions that nearly 24 people were arrested. I used to see these types of things happen where the photographer would literally try to get at an angle so he could get everyone in the shot to make it look like they were just a sliver of the crowd that happened to be there. But they would bring 12 people in and maybe take a picture of them at an angle to give you the impression as you were looking at the picture that you were just looking at one little slice out of hundreds of people who were there. But I would attend various events. I remember in my past life, I was often working as the master of ceremonies at various Tea Party events, and we would draw 1,400 or 1,500 people out, and yet we could get barely any media coverage. But if you had 6 old hippies playing hacky sack at an Occupy demonstration, it was front page news. And so here we go again. Media is essentially just trying to tell you what it wants you to hear, and they've appointed themselves the arbiters of what's right and wrong in this country, even though they don't have any skill at that. I saw this story, too. As long as we're talking, what do they say in television? In a related story, in Boston, Massachusetts, a Catholic school has withdrawn from the St. Patrick's Day parade because the parade has decided it is going to have gay marchers. And here's a quote from the school principal. "We can't associate with that. It would appear we were condoning it." I think that's a pretty good message. But the school is being attacked, of course, because, that Bible thing just keeps getting in the way. And if we would just tear out the pages and be nice to everybody, then we could all light candles and the whole world would be brighter. One last point on that, too. The man who serves as the Roman Catholic Archbishop of San Francisco, he has stated that no one can work in his Catholic schools if they are living in sin, as it used to be called. If they are living in the same home with a partner, doesn't matter if you got a straight partner or a gay partner, if you're not married, you cannot teach in the schools because you set a bad example for the children. He has also said you cannot advocate for other lifestyles within the schools. He is being attacked. Well, if you don't want your children going to his school, then find another. But they have to bend you to their will. That's what it's all about. You know what it is? Deep down in, they really feel guilty about their lifestyles, and they know they're going to be judged. I think this is what it really is all about. And they know they are going to be judged, so they want you to go to hell with them for fellowship. And I don't know that you necessarily have to. It's not easy because I have friends who are of that persuasion. And you know what? If it costs me my friendship, I have to make a choice about where I'm going, the nether reaches or perhaps to heaven. And I have to work at that very hard. But I have to follow my conscience, and I have to follow what my faith tells me. Well, Archbishop Cordileone, that is his name, he is now faced with the prospect. His opponents have hired a very high-priced public relations firm. And they're now attacking him publicly in media every day. And they say a revolution is brewing in San Francisco Catholic Church against Archbishop Cordileone morality clauses. And the writer goes on to say that he has focused on morality and religious practice because confusion is prevalent about the church's stance on these issues. Well, they've had to drag in a professional to attack him. I got to tell you, what do they think they're going to do? Some sort of hostile takeover? In the long run, it's predicted my guy wins. You got to look at it that way. Steve Millington is going to join us in just a few minutes. Bill Colley with you on Top Story. Well, we have a very special guest joining us in the studio today, and of course, he frequently joins us. In fact, just about every Tuesday morning. I almost said Monday. Sometimes Tuesdays, that Monday feeling carries over just a little bit. Steve Millington in studio. He is the chairman of the Twin Falls County Republican Party. Welcome back.
Thank you. It's good to be here.
We should point out you're listening to News Radio 1310 KLIX and newsradio1310.com online, where you can hear us anywhere around the world. 28 right now at 8:34. You had a few things you wanted to address today, and of course, we were going to start out, I believe, with just some issues taking place at the state capitol.
Yeah, let's talk about a couple, three of them. This morning, the Senate, the Idaho State Senate, is going to vote on a bill to create a March election for a presidential primary. Now, in 2012, we had what we call the presidential caucus, and it was conducted in early March, and the objective was they wanted to have more presidential candidates come to Idaho and walk around and shake hands and give us their speech. And the idea was that Idaho doesn't get any, we're like Rodney Dangerfield, you get no respect. So we had the caucus, and it had its share of problems. It was a first-time ever event, and so there was, although there was a lot of careful planning went into it, it still had a few speed bumps along the way. But the real issue in my mind is not necessarily that the caucus needed to be revised somewhat. My concern is that in order for us to have a democratic republic, we need to have the opportunity of elections to vote for those who will govern us. And the caucus, sure, you can go just go to the local caucus location and cast your ballot. However, it only takes place between 6 and 9 o'clock at night, and only on this Tuesday night, and et cetera, et cetera. And it's not like a regular primary election where the polls are open from 8 to 8, and we do have a definite, defined method of absentee ballots. And one of the things that they're considering is creating some kind of a absentee ballot program for the caucus. But let's just, and I hope people don't give me the label of being some kind of a conspiracy theorist. But let's take this caucus thing to let's just extrapolate it forward a little bit. If the caucus is such a great idea, then why don't we just use caucuses to elect all of the people in primary elections? So we would go to the local county, and the county precinct committee persons would vote for a list of names, and that list of names would appear on the general election ballot. We wouldn't have a primary election. The precinct committee people would select the individuals who would be allowed, permitted, or authorized to run in the general election.
So it was done 100 years ago.
Well, it's still done currently today in Russia. There is a predetermined list of who will be on the ballot and who can never get on the ballot. And that's when you go to vote. They have a very high turnout over there, huge turnout, because they check the list, and if you didn't vote, you get a visit from some very unfriendly people.
Yes.
So, today at sometime this morning between 10 and noon, the Idaho Senate is going to vote on a measure which would permit a March presidential primary election. And that it would just be for the presidential candidates only. We would still have our regular primary election the fourth Tuesday of May. Man, I hope it's the fourth Tuesday. Oh, I hope I didn't get that. But it's the latter part of May. I think it's the fourth Tuesday of May.
You have a few months to correct yourself.
Yeah, I can do that. But in March, we would have a presidential primary. Only once every 4 years in the primary or in the presidential election year, we would have it as an early March primary. And I think the objective with this measure is that our presidential primary would coincide with the, quote, Super Tuesday elections that they have around the country. So that Idaho would be amongst those states that would be involved in that particular election cycle. And as far as I'm concerned, one of the great benefits of living in a democratic republic is my right to vote for those who will govern me. And so I think we need to have elections, and we need to use them properly and often, because that's one of the measures by which we will maintain our republic and the freedoms associated with it. If we start allocating or assigning or, quote, delegating, unquote, this function to some select body, we give away all of our rights. And that ends up with a very unfavorable result.
We have to take a short break and hear from some of our fine sponsors. Steve Millington is our guest until 9 o'clock this morning. He is the chairman of the Twin Falls County Republican Party. And you're listening to News Radio 1310 KLIX, newsradio1310.com as well online. 28 at our, wait a second, update 29 at our studios coming up on 840. Bill Colley with you until 10 o'clock this morning. Hope you can stick around. We've got a lot of other exciting things to talk about. Our guest in the studio, Steve Millington, and he is the chairman of the Twin Falls County Republican Party. Bill Colley with you on Top Story on News Radio 1310 KLIX, as well as online at newsradio1310.com. I know I have a few friends out there who do tune in periodically on the web stream. And if you're traveling out of town, you can take us along. Just remember, you can listen to us in a hotel room or in an airport terminal, anywhere you happen to be, simply by going to newsradio1310.com. Also, you can check out our Facebook page. That's News Radio 1310 KLIX, and some great posts there. In fact, school bus accident in a neighboring county. I don't like to talk too much about these in advance because we don't know if there are any injuries or not, and we don't want to panic anyone, but we'll have more details forthcoming on that a little bit later. Steve Millington, you have a telephone call already, 844.
I'm sure I do.
29 right now at our studios. And Colley, you're on the air with us. What's on your mind?
I just wanted to ask Steve if they've talked about in the legislature getting this the presidential primary election on the February date, because a few years ago they just tried to get all of the elections coordinated into 4 different ones a year.
I don't know that we have, and here's part of the reason for that. The National Republican Committee, for some odd reason, and I will never understand this, I think it's New Hampshire has the first place position. They get to have their election or caucus or whatever first, and nobody can go ahead of New Hampshire. And then Iowa always has one right after that. And then they have in early March, they have the thing called the Super Tuesday thing where they have everybody else piles in. Now, there is one other little interesting characteristic about this presidential primary thing. If you have a presidential primary before the 1st of March, you have to allocate delegates based on percentage of vote. If you do it afterwards, like this we call it early March, but it's kind of like it'd be the second Tuesday of March. I think that's the date that they've got it pegged at, second Tuesday of March. Then if we have a winner, someone who gets 50% plus one, they get the entire Idaho delegation in one block for the first round. So there's 2 or 3 things at play. One is we want to be early enough. We used to have our presidential primary at the end of May, and by the end of May, the process is pretty much complete. Everybody's got their delegates lined up, and so it's just a moot point. So we wanted to move it further ahead in order to give us just a little bit more opportunity.
I want to thank you for the call, too, as well.
It's interesting that Idaho, although we have we only have 4 electoral votes. In 2012, we had an extraordinarily large number of voting delegates to the convention. And I'm struggling with the number, but I think we had close to 30 votes at the Republican convention. And part of the reason we have so many votes is we are such a strong Republican state. We have Republican leadership. All 4 members of the congressional offices are all Republicans. And so we get extra votes because we are a little bit more Republican-minded than many other states are.
I have a solution on these primary things. Take all 50 states, and what you do is you take 12, and they have a primary in early March. 13 have a primary in early April, 12 in early May, and the last 13 in early June. And then 4 years later, the guys who are in the front go to the back, and the guys who were second move up. So you
and
just
start it over again.
Right, you rotate it that way every 4 elections, and so you get your state at times will get a chance to be in the early going.
You'll be the front runner every 4th year.
Yeah,
sure,
and something like that.
Now I've heard people say, why don't we just have 2 or 3, not the 4 like you're suggesting, but 2 or 3 dates, one in March, one in April, and one in May, and everybody votes or selects or makes choices on one of those specified dates.
Right.
Then the candidates would have 12 states or 15 states that they would work hard in for this month prior to the election. Then they would move to the next 15 or 20 states, and then they'd move to the remaining 15 or 20 states. And I've often wondered, that doesn't really make makes a lot of sense. It's not a bad idea. And they could kind of consolidate. No, that's too much common sense. We can't afford to do. We got to spend billions of dollars to get people elected. And that's part of the problem is it's become you got to follow the money.
It's great for media.
Oh, yeah.
Ad buys.
Yeah.
848-29 at our studios. Steve Millington, our guest in studio, News Radio 1310 KLIX and newsradio1310.com. And Bill Colley with you on Top Story. We have another caller joining us. You're on the air on News Radio 1310 KLIX. And what's on your mind?
What's on my mind is the comment that he made that he wanted to vote somebody in that would govern him. I think our biggest problem is we're voting people in to speak. Supposed to be speaking on our behalf instead of speaking to us. So instead of governing us, they need to govern on our behalf.
There's an interesting point. Too many times people are more concerned about themselves than they are about governing the general populace. And one of my complaints, I think it was George Washington in his farewell address, he kind of blasted the political party idea because he said eventually the parties will become more prominent or preeminent than the republic. And boy, is that not true? Have we reached that point or what?
Yeah. I think some people...
The parties are the major thing, not governing the republic.
Speaking of parties, I'm looking at a TV monitor up here, and we referenced this in an email off air earlier today. That House chamber in Washington, there's Chuck Schumer, for instance. See, he is a Jewish man representing a Jewish constituency in New York. He is not going to, as a Democrat, boycott this event with Netanyahu.
I'll bet he's not.
I would say, though, that you can see Ben Cardin, same thing, a Jewish senator from Maryland. He's coming into the room right now, and a Democrat. So Debbie Wasserman Schultz, because she has a heavily Jewish district, has decided, even though she's the national DNC chair, she's going to be there as well. But the place is filled, and as Barbara Mikulski, you can see all these people wandering in, a lot of Democrats. But the place is absolutely packed. They're showing the pictures right now. Netanyahu's speech is probably going to be the most... Churchill spoke 3 times to Congress. This, I think, is Netanyahu's 3rd. This may be the most watched speech by a foreign leader ever to Congress. What do you think about these Democrats who decided they're not going to show up?
I haven't. The curiosity that I have is, why do we want to snub Netanyahu? And it's not the man, it's the position. He's the prime minister of the nation of Israel. Why would we want to snub him at our body of governing, legislating influence? Why do we snub him? I mean, common sense, civil decency demands that you show up, shake hands, listen attentively. You don't have to agree with everything he says, but what happened to civility? What happened to the common sense? What happened to... And by the way, these are the people who are always first to line up behind the United States, not behind us, next to us, beside us. Why are we snubbing them so viciously and so publicly? I can't. It just boggles my mind.
Well, we already know that one of Mr. Obama's cohorts referred about a year ago to Netanyahu as a chicken poop, but he didn't say poop.
Yeah, that's right. He used a different four-letter word.
Netanyahu was serving in a special forces brigade when he was young as an Israeli citizen, although he spent most of his childhood years in Philadelphia. And while Mr. Obama was out smoking dope somewhere with his buddies at the same age.
Right.
So I never could quite understand that description, but clearly there's an issue between the two men.
Well, and I think Netanyahu's speech, his objective here is to bring attention to this proposed treaty with Iran over their nuclear enhancement. And I watched a news clip just over the weekend, and the individual who was saying that this treaty, the acceptance of this treaty would be a tragic error for the United States, because in most of these centrifuge enrichment facilities, you only need to remove a few key components. And it looks like just a nuclear reactor for power generation. But you put these other components back in line, and now you have a uranium enrichment facility that can make nuclear weapons. And he said, with a team of skilled technicians, engineers, and 24 hours, I can change a enrichment facility back to a just nuclear power facility. And when everybody says, oh yeah, they're not doing anything wrong, this is nuclear power, blah, 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 in 24 hours I can be back to enriching uranium for nuclear weapons. He says, any nuclear physicist in the country, if they've got an advanced degree, can tell you how to do that in 15 minutes.
And the leader of Iran apparently sent out a tweet last night saying that by the will of God, the world is beginning to hate Israel, which should tell us a little bit about what they believe.
Right.
We have a caller with us, Steve. It's 854-29 at Top Story. Steve Millington is our guest until 9 o'clock this morning. News Radio 1310 KLIX and newsradio1310.com. My name is Bill Colley, and you're up next. You're on the air.
Well, I think, Bill, that the reason that they're snubbing him is because it messes with their agenda of what's going on, with what they're planning. With Eric Holder, this is so incredible what this man is doing. And all of the lawless stuff that he is, it is so out of control. And I'll tell you, the last time I heard a leader come out and be criticized so bad, and then him come out and say be so gracious and so caring of the United States and praising Obama. The last person I ever heard say that was Ronald Reagan.
I'm old enough to remember Ronald Reagan a lot. And there are times when I just go out and I wander around in the countryside and I say to myself, where is our next Ronald Reagan? I read an interesting editorial in a news magazine just a couple weeks ago, and what it basically said was, we cannot depend upon good luck to provide us the kind of leadership that we need. We were very fortunate back in the 70s and 80s when we had leaders like Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan, and they mentioned in conjunction with those two political leaders, Pope John Paul. Now, I think it was John Paul IV or
Second.
Second, okay. But anyway, we had leaders who were real leaders, who could understand the responsibility that they had been entrusted with and took action to preserve and protect. Maybe I could even use the words to promulgate or perfect that leadership role. And we have just absolutely thrown it under the bus, tromped it into the mud. And you say to yourself, how could we have done this in such a short time?
I believe we saw, if I was just looking a couple of minutes ago, I think the camera was panning through, but I think I saw Senator Risch. So, our congressional delegation, all is there and being counted.
Yep, I think all of our people. I talked with Senator Crapo last week, and I asked him, and he said, you better believe I'm going to be right there in my assigned seat, and I'm going to be cheering. So I believe all of our people will be there.
Your good friend John Kasich is there, too, as well as a guest, apparently. Governor of Ohio, right?
Yes, Governor of Ohio. I'm not surprised.
I think I saw him in the crowd as they're moving the camera around.
It's a little. There was an old axiom that whenever a void occurs, something will arise to fill it. And in world politics, there is a huge void in the leadership role. For many years, since World War II, the United States has always provided the leadership role. And we have not always been perfect. I'm not going to, but we have always been there, and we have always left every nation better than we found it. And we have to continue that. In the absence of leadership, we have anarchy. And in this case, it's world anarchy.
On that note, we'll wrap up. I've got more about Netanyahu coming up in the next hour, of course, when he starts speaking. And I do want to point out that room has to be the hottest ticket in Washington right now.
Well, I'll bet it is.
Steve Millington, thanks for coming by.
Thanks, Bill. See you again.
Steve is the chairman of the Twin Falls County Republican Party. It's 8:58, coming up on 8:59:29 at our studios. You're listening to News Radio 1310 KLIX and newsradio1310.com. One more hour of Top Story with Bill Colley still ahead. And a good morning to everyone. We are just awaiting, even on our end, the appearance of the Israeli Prime Minister speaking to a joint session of Congress today, actually taking place in the House chamber. You're listening to Top Story with Bill Colley this morning. It is 9:06:29 at our studios, News Radio 1310 KLIX, newsradio1310.com. This thing has been expected for months. It has been controversial, of course, from the get-go, because not so much people in the White House, although their allies in media, which, again, 85% of the people who are reporting in Washington have been trying to portray this as somehow the kind, innocent Obama is being trampled by this vicious, nasty, warmongering Prime Minister of Israel, who now is just entering the House chamber to applause. We were commenting in the last hour when Steve Millington was here about the number of Democrats who did show up, who may have at one point wanted to boycott it in order to curry favor with their president, albeit he's gone in less than 2 years, so perhaps they don't have to do that any longer. But while I was watching these people enter the room, I was noting that a lot of them happen to be Jewish, and they happen to come from constituencies where there is a heavy Jewish vote. Ben Cardin of Maryland, good example. Chuck Schumer of New York, they're both serving in the U.S. Senate. Debbie Wasserman Schultz, who serves in the House of Representatives from Florida, and she is the chairwoman of the Democrat National Committee. She's there as well. Why? Because her district is overwhelmingly Jewish. And you don't want to get on the bad side of your constituents by boycotting a speech by Benjamin Netanyahu, especially if 6 months to a year down the road, there is a horrific attack on Israel, which there could be if this deal goes through. Do you really believe that the Iranians are sincere? I was reading some comments this morning in the Jerusalem Post. It's a Murdoch-owned newspaper, or it was at one time. That would be News Corp, Fox News, and the like. But I was reading the Jerusalem Post. I was reading some of the stories there. I get it in my daily email. You can go look it up online, and then what you can do, they ask you if you'd like to subscribe. It's free. You put down your email address, and it comes on a daily basis. It arrives here about an hour before I actually go on the air with the show. And I was reading some of the stories in there. For all of the talk from the Obama White House about how this is going to be such a wonderful deal with Iran, the Iranians, on the other hand, they're making fun of him. They're mocking him on a daily basis. They're mocking Israel on a daily basis. How can you claim, Newt Gingrich, by the way, with his wife Callista also in the crowd. I'm watching the panning of the crowd right now as the Prime Minister enters the room and is greeting various people on his way to actually speak. We have a caller with us. 736-0300 is the line to reach us at Top Story and News Radio 1310 KLIX and newsradio1310.com. You're on the air with Bill Colley. What's up with you?
Yes, sir. Are you there?
Yes, I am. Go ahead.
Yeah, are they going to are they going to view or hear Benjamin Netanyahu?
Well, not here on the radio this morning.
Not on the radio this morning.
No. Television seems to be the only option at the moment.
Okay. Anything you want to tell him?
What's that?
Carry on the good work.
Hey, thanks.
Carry on the good work.
Thank you very much for the call, sir. The problem with the speech carrying it live on the radio was we didn't know exactly, because it was scheduled to start. We're already at 10 minutes after 9. It was scheduled to start at 9 o'clock our time. And by the time he makes his way through the crowd, and he's still not quite there yet. Now he's greeting John Boehner and some of the other leaders who happened to be there and shaking hands. Was trying to find a hard start time. Plus, one thing I learned in talk radio a long, long time ago is you never interrupt Rush Limbaugh if you can help it. Big, big mistake. And if he is late making the speech and the speech bleeds past 10 o'clock, then interrupting Rush, not a good idea. But you'll be able, of course, anywhere in this day and age to catch up with the remarks that he made. Likely C-SPAN, if you have cable, will carry the remarks again in tape delay for a couple of days. And they'll be available on the internet in various places too. Real Clear Politics, realclearpolitics.com would be a great place to go later in the day if you miss it this morning and you'd like to see it. But it is quite a spectacle. There does not appear, despite the boycott by some of these people, it does not appear that there is an empty seat in that chamber. In fact, it is a standing room only crowd at this point. We have another caller with us. You're up next on News Radio 1310 KLIX and Top Story. And what's on your mind? All right, we're going to try that one more time. All right, this is our lucky caller. The last call didn't pop up on the air, but this caller is with us. I guarantee it. You're on the air on News Radio 1310. See, now we're hearing from some of the boycotters by the sounds of things this morning. 736-0300, 736-0300 in order to reach our program today. Washington Times today has a piece called When Iran Goes Nuclear by R. James Woolsey and Peter Vincent Pry. If you get an opportunity and you see the Times online, please take a look at that. Woolsey is a former director of the Central Intelligence Agency and chairman of the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. Peter Vincent Pry is executive director of the EMP Task Force. You know why he's writing this? Because one well-placed nuclear explosion by either the Iranians or the North Koreans could take out our electrical grid. That is a huge concern to a great, great many people that we happen to be dealing with.
Switches.
Oh, that is a huge deal for a great many people that we happen to be dealing with. And I think that at this point that we have to note that if the Iranians had a bomb and they were to launch it along with the North Koreans, who could do it as well from the other side of the world, and that nuclear bomb exploded over our heads, and it didn't necessarily land in any particular city, but if it exploded in the air, let's say over Nebraska, the electromagnetic pulse of all of that would likely take out our electrical grid, perhaps for a year, if not for several years. That itself would be a serious concern. So if you get a chance, as I was saying, check out the Washington Times website today and a column by R. James Woolsey, formerly with the Central Intelligence Agency, and Peter Vincent Pry, because these people are writing about the situation and the threat that the Iranians actually pose. And as I was mentioning a bit earlier, all of the news reports that do not get washed and cleansed by what you see here in the United States with U.S. media, establishment media in the United States, if you are reading news reports coming from the other side of the world, there are serious, serious doubts about this situation with the Israeli government, and also the trust you could have for Iran. Mr. Netanyahu is beginning his remarks right now. A bit of a late start for his speech before the joint session of Congress, just simply because while he walked through the room, he was stopped probably by a couple of hundred people who wanted to greet him and shake his hand at that point. It's 9:14. You're listening to Top Story. Bill Colley with you on News Radio 1310, KLIX, as well as newsradio1310.com. And you can reach our program this morning by calling 736-0300, or you have another option, and that would be you could drop me an email at bill.colley@townsquaremedia.com. The last name is spelled Colley. That is bill.colley@townsquaremedia.com. And a couple of other things, too, to remind you about coming up in a few minutes on the program. We have some other topics, too, as well, that we're going to be telling you about. There is a fellow who warns that if neighboring Utah goes ahead with plans for approval of medical marijuana, that the rabbits who are out in the wild in Utah in many places will end up perpetually stoned. I know that is a crisis of earth-shattering proportions. I've got something on that. I'll mention that a bit later. Also, there is a fellow out of England by the name of Lord Monckton who says the projections or the predictions or now the people who are saying 2014 was the warmest year on record is a bunch of hogwash. If we get an opportunity, I'd like to maybe mention those things a bit later in the hour of the program or the final hour of the program, as well as an organization called the Republic of Texas, which recently was raided by law enforcement while they're having a meeting, and many of the people who were at the meeting were dragged away, hauled off to jail, and we don't necessarily know if they actually violated any law. But it could well be that this is the latest attempt, now that the IRS has been found out. This may be the latest attempt by government to intimidate people who are lovers of the Constitution and suspicious of government. So just wanted to share all of that with everybody this morning. As I was mentioning this story out of the Washington Times, there's a couple of other commentaries too as well this morning. This one from Stephen Rosen. He says, a big story that is not being reported in the United States is that the International Criminal Court is going to have a new member coming up at the beginning of April, and that new member is going to be the Palestinian state. And once they get a seat on that panel, they are going to start charging members of the Israeli government with war crimes. And again, not being reported in this country. And yet the President of the United States is urging the Israelis, longtime allies of the United States, to make concessions, more concessions with the Palestinians, including open borders, so more and more Palestinian bombers can come back and forth across from Gaza and apparently blow up school buses and kill young schoolgirls in Israel. And the writer also says Israel, following its elections 2 weeks from today, will not have a fully functioning government for some weeks after the vote takes place because past experience says there will need to be a coalition, and it may take 2 months before Mr. Netanyahu, who still is expected to win, it may take 2 months before he can put that together. I should note, he must be hitting some high notes because even Dianne Feinstein of California was up applauding him a moment ago while he was actually speaking. And she had said that she was going, but she wasn't necessarily enthralled and thought she would be sitting on her hands. But in some of the pictures I saw just a moment ago, she was on her feet, actually giving him some applause. And one other last point, he lives in a very dangerous neighborhood in that part of the world. We don't understand how small Israel is and that you could drive across it east to west in a matter of hours in some spots. And all around these people are hostile neighbors. And that neighborhood has been that way for as long as anyone can remember. And to sit here and lecture them about how they should secure their borders and how they should protect their own nation is really the height of hypocrisy. There is a story from the Jerusalem Post that says the Mossad, and that is the Israeli Secret Service, has been deciphering communications from ISIS and Al-Qaeda, which are encoded in internet pornography. In other words, you would not see these with a naked eye because you'd be looking at something else. No pun intended. And what happens is that these get sent to someone halfway around the world. That individual is picking out the encoded messages, and it could be orders for attacks and the like. And it says, Israeli cyber warriors were tracking message boards online in search of specially encrypted messages from the likes of Al-Qaeda and Islamic State. And one of the writers who was involved with this story says the groups often use pornographic material to conceal documents and orders for the next target. Think about this for a moment. ISIS is set up, it's got shops set up in Syria and Iraq. It is closer to Israel, far closer to Israel than we are to Las Vegas or Portland or Seattle. And they don't have the mountain range. They may have some hilly territory, but they don't have the mountain range to deal with that we have. So I'm sharing that with you because if ISIS turns to the south, which it will eventually do or plans to do, and join in an attack on Israel and perhaps then suddenly has some Arab allies who decide to get on board, throw in their lot with these terrorists, the drive is very, very short. And again, we have people in our own government who just refuse to acknowledge that. 20 minutes after 9 o'clock. Bill Colley with you on Top Story. News Radio 1310 KLIX, newsradio1310.com online. And we have odd story coming up in just a moment. Stoned rabbits in the state of Utah. Just ahead. Wanted to mention quickly, if I could, during this segment of the program, our good friends at Western States Bus Services, who are training school bus drivers. They're hiring part-time bus drivers right now, split shifts, 5 days per week, summers off. And remember, the training is included in all of this. You don't have to pay for that. And scheduled no school days. Pay is $10.75 per hour. You can apply today by contacting 733-8003. Western States Bus Services is an equal opportunity employer. Before I tell you about the stoned rabbits, 30 right now at our studios, 924 rather, on Top Story. Bill Colley with you on News Radio 1310 KLIX and newsradio1310.com. You can reach our program today by dialing us at 736-0300 or drop me an email at bill.colley@townsquaremedia.com. Last name spelled Colley. Washington Post, a writer by the name of Christopher Ingraham, who thinks, Ingram, I guess is the proper pronunciation, like Laura's name, thinks that this is somewhat of an interesting story and perhaps even somewhat funny. DEA, that's the Drug Enforcement Agency, warns of stoned rabbits if Utah passes medical marijuana. I know. I had to look at that one for a couple of minutes and ask myself, do rabbits actually have a taste for marijuana? Well, apparently they do. Utah is considering a bill that would allow patients with certain debilitating conditions to be treated with edible forms of marijuana. If the bill passes, the state's wildlife may, quote, cultivate a taste, unquote, for the plant, lose their fear of humans, and basically be high all the time. Yes, the rabbits would be bouncing around the forest, buzzed, I don't know, it'd be a real mess. That's according to testimony presented to a Utah Senate panel last week by an agent of the Drug Enforcement Administration. He is a member of the marijuana eradication team in Utah. I don't imagine that Utah, just knowing the culture there, that Utah really has a serious issue with a lot of wildly grown marijuana. It doesn't strike me. You know, when you look at the test scores of the students, which are, off the charts nationally, among the best, and you look at the crime stats from Utah, among the best anywhere in the country, I can't imagine that a lot of people are cultivating marijuana. But this fellow, his job is to go out and take those plants out of the ground and get rid of them when they're spotted. Some of his colleagues in Georgia, the writer says, recently achieved notoriety by raiding a retiree's garden and seizing okra plants. I guess after they figured out it was okra, they probably gave the plants back. But trying to put them back in the ground and get them to continue to grow may not be the simplest of all tasks. The writer says if corn were outlawed and cartels started growing it in national forests, the per-plant environmental toll would be about the same. So people who would start growing marijuana for medical purposes, he believes, wouldn't necessarily harm the environment. But some wild animals apparently do develop a taste for marijuana buds. And you're reminded you've got to keep it away from your pets if you have any. But the writer says, I don't know that the occasional high rabbit constitutes grounds for keeping marijuana prohibition in place any more than drunk squirrels are an argument for outlawing alcohol. Does anybody know any drunk squirrels? I know some friends when they're drunk, they're a little squirrely, but I don't know any drunk squirrels. And apparently the argument is that this will greatly harm the wildlife in Utah if this happens. And in Idaho, there is talk, of course, about, at least for people with epilepsy, approving some cannabinoid oils that would help with the seizures that people have in many cases. So again, you are gradually going to see these laws, likely in all 50 states, ease to the point where one day we're all Washington and Colorado. And people will walk around the streets just toking away, unless, of course, it's a no-smoking zone. But then liberals who make these laws will just decide that's only for tobacco, that's not for their sacrament, the wacky weed. And speaking of health issues, and this one comes out of Boise, 928, Bill Colley with you on Top Story, News Radio 1310, KLIX, and newsradio1310.com. A bill that would ban doctors from prescribing abortion-inducing medication through telemedicine has passed in the Idaho House on a party line vote. I'm glad to see that, and I'll tell you why. We had a guest on from Right to Life a couple of weeks ago talking about this. It is not yet happening in Idaho, but this will ensure that a doctor from hundreds of miles away could not instruct someone on how to take drugs that would then induce an abortion. You're up next at 9:28. Good morning. You're on Top Story.
Yeah, good morning. Before coming to Idaho over 40 years ago, my lab technician in California was stoned half the time, and I couldn't get any work out of him. So I know what it does for work performance. Maybe there is some medical benefits, but overall, we'll have a stoned society. That's what will happen, and it's already happening and causing lots of problems. So anyway, that's my experience with it. I just think we're just allowing more and more of this stuff into our society, and I think it's just a shame that we don't take a stand, against these things. We just kind of tolerate it, and then pretty soon it's accepted.
Yeah, and it's happened with so many different barriers have fallen, gambling, and that probably being the one that's most visible to most people. Thank you much for the call. On the other hand, if you're a rabbit hunter, it might make it actually easier to go hunting rabbits. You think about that. You think about all those people who are pulled over for stone driving. Instead of speeding, they're usually driving about 5-10 miles per hour while they think they're driving the speed limit. So if you're out hunting rabbits, he's not going to be taking off anywhere really fast. Just a thought. By the way, was last year the warmest year on record? Well, it might have been in this part of Idaho. At least it so far might be that way this year. But one denier, as he's called by the left, says, no, it certainly isn't. That's coming up. When Steve Millington was in studio with me in the last hour, he was pointing out Boise had its warmest February on record. Now, of course, we're not looking at perhaps hundreds of years of records here. We don't really know what the weather was like throughout this region for tens of thousands of years, because the people who are actually doing the measurements only arrived in the last 150 years or so, and not really in droves until really just 125 years ago or so. And if Boise had its warmest February on record, it's probably likely that Twin Falls had its warmest February on record as well. 9:34, Bill Colley with you on News Radio 1310 KLIX, and you can hear us online anywhere around the world at newsradio1310.com. Yet, my sister went through the entire, and she's in western New York State, she went through the entire month of February without a day above 32 degrees. It never got above freezing for the entire month. January 29th, and I think today, here we are in March, is the first time it's going to be above freezing since January 29th. And the cities that are neighboring her all set records for their coldest Februaries on record. They have not had a winter this cold in 21 years. And 21 years ago, I don't know that it was all being attributed to global warming, or now as they call it, climate change. You see, because when it's cold like that in some places, that sort of harms the argument about global warming. So they've had to go change that to climate change. I also happened to see online this morning that the sea ice in Antarctica is at a record. Now, before you run off with that one and say, aha, these people are full of baloney, up in the Arctic, it's the opposite. They have lost sea ice. So one end of the planet is doing very well when it comes to ice, and the other end, not so much. Whenever I hear these arguments, I always remember that we came out of an ice age 10, 12,000 years ago, and we've been coming out of it on a gradual basis, which means the planet has been getting warmer, other than, the Maunder Minimum, which was called that cold period that took place for about 500 years and really had a lot to do with the founding of the United States and revolutions around the world. That was a bit of a setback. But overall, temperatures and climate have been moderating. And while they're two separate things, the scientists will say they're two separate things, climate is a series of temperatures. That's all it is. It's like pulling out a yardstick. An inch is not a yardstick, but on the other hand, a yardstick is comprised of inches. And so that's how we build this. Here is something from a publication called Heartlander. Now, we've been hearing that last year was the warmest year on record by some arguments, but according to Lord Christopher Monckton, who is he's a fly in the ointment for the climate change people, a Britisher, he has been following this for years. He says, NOAA and several other principal terrestrial temperature data sets, which are subject to measurement, coverage, and bias uncertainties, and have been repeatedly revised in a questionable fashion over the past year to show ever greater rates of warming, have not yet reported their December 2014 values. So if they haven't, then they can't really say that the 11 months make it the warmest year on record. But he brings up something else. They have gone back and revised temperature sets around the world over the last 30, 40, 50 years to try and get to their point. So if you had some numbers that were entered in 1974, what they've gone back and done is changed some of those numbers and argued they could not have been right. So they can bring you to the conclusion that the world is frying to a crisp. 9:37. Bill Colley with you on News Radio 1310 KLIX and newsradio1310.com online. He writes from some charts he's showing in his story. It is apparent from the graph that 2014 was not the warmest year on record. Several previous years have been warmer, including the El Nino years 1998 and 2010. In fact, some 70% of the years since the last ice age were warmer than today. There you have it. He says the Nature article also says high temperatures in California in 2014 helped drive the widespread drought, but he says, however, they show a decline in the global land area under drought worldwide over the last 30 years. So it's not as bad in some spots, perhaps, as we're being told. And why are we being told that? Well, because the anti-capitalists have another agenda. 9:38, you're on the air on News Radio 1310 KLIX. Hello?
Hello, yes. I must have some trouble with the volume on my phone.
Ah, well, I've had that too. Yes, I can. Go ahead.
Okay. I've been calling several different times talking to different people on different sets about what I had learned in the third grade when we studied how the ice age had moved down clear into the central area of North America and all the way up from the southern Antarctica, clear up into parts of Brazil. No one seems to know, no scientists have been able to understand why that phenomena took place. Nor can they explain why all of a sudden the Earth changed its mind and decided to warm back up again, which it has been doing ever since then. And there's no one can deny the fact that this receding cold spell has been going on ever since the Ice Age. Then why of all of a sudden have people decided to blame all of this on human actions and anything that we might be doing as a human race? The fastest rate of recess of any of the glaciers in the northern hemisphere took place between 1650 and 1750, as recorded by Russian fur trappers that had mapped the whole Aleutian area. And that was the fastest that any of the glaciers have ever receded.
And they did that without a smokestack. Hey, I've got to let you run because I've got a hard break coming up, but thank you. Great point to be made there. And you know, the Earth has been warming up for 12,000 years. And we had very little to do with it. Well, maybe not. There could be something called terraforming. Maybe that's something to bring up later. Also, Republic of Texas under assault by the government. Details coming up on News Radio 1310 KLIX. I think one of the most fascinating theories I've heard about the warming of the planet came from a story I read back in the late 1990s. As the glaciers receded, people started actually farming. And we didn't do a lot of that. And they started keeping livestock. And because of that, we terraformed the Earth, which may mean we'll never, ever see another return to an ice age. Well, all right. But at least it makes the odds of it happening a little bit less. 9:44, 31 right now at our studios. Bill Colley with you on Top Story on News Radio 1310 KLIX and newsradio1310.com online. We have a caller with us. No, these people today just continually deciding that they just don't want to stick around. And why call if you don't want to talk? You're up next, and you're on the air on News Radio 1310 KLIX.
Bill, I got two things to go here. You know, first one is with the global warming thing. It's just amazing over the last several months. You know, with the snows in Boston and everything else. They go, see. We've had this record. We haven't had weather like this for 100 years. Wait, so it happened 100 years ago. So it revolves around. The second one is, you know, I'm getting a little upset every time I hear that no one understands what's going on with our leadership. You know, my dad taught me when I was growing up, if it walked like a duck, sounded like a duck, looked like a duck, swam with ducks,
yes,
it's a duck.
Yes. Yeah, I'd agree with that. I thank you for the call. By the way, Dianne Feinstein, who said she would not be applauding Mr. Netanyahu's speech, I've seen her up now twice on her feet applauding his remarks. Then again, her constituency might actually have some people in it who, but she's not running again, is she? You're up next. You're on the air with Bill Colley on Top Story.
Yeah. Good morning, Bill.
Morning.
On that weather stuff, that last snowstorm, I live south of Twin Falls, and this stuff they keep spraying in the air and on their chemtrails. I have a patch of snow out there. It's about 2 inches deep. I say snow, it's chem stuff. And it's like about 3 inches wide, 2 inches deep, and 1.5 feet long. It's out in the sunlight all day long. All the other stuff in the yard's melted. This one spot yesterday, I just went and did a little experiment I'd heard on the radio. Somebody down in Colorado had done it. Put it on the stove. It sat there in a pan for about 5 minutes. Finally started to melt a little bit. And then it's got all this black stuff in it. It looks like plastic.
I was going to say, it almost has, you got there first. I was almost going to say it has the sound of plastic. And a lot of that, when you mention what's in those trails behind those planes, that's going to be pretty toxic stuff. If not toxic, at least just messy like that. And yes, chemtrails, whether or not you believe, and the conspiracy theory is that they're putting something in the chemtrails that is actually controlling us, sort of like a saltpeter falling from the sky. But the other part of this is they are responsible for changing weather because they will fill in. I brought it up a couple of weeks ago. A chemtrail, if you fly a plane in a big circle and leave a trail, and what'll happen is then the center of that circle will fill in on its own, like a cloud, and then drift across hundreds to thousands of miles before it breaks up. So yeah, they have a tremendous impact on weather. And we haven't even discussed that in the long run about how that could be affecting climate around the globe, other than the fact that there's a lot of activity going on up there. And the people who claim that the world is going to fry to a crisp will say that we shouldn't be flying, although they do, and they drive. And yeah, they do all those things too, but you're not supposed to. That's what they mean. One other quick thing before we get to Mike Huckabee this morning. I wanted to mention this yesterday. We didn't get a chance. There was an organization that has been around in Texas for many, many years called Republic of Texas, and they believe they're a fairly peaceful group. One of their members got into a small firefight with police officers in 1997, but that's not to say that he is indicative of the entire group. They are proto-Tea Party, if you will. They believe the annexation of Texas into the United States back in 1845 was illegally done and was unconstitutional. And they have been arguing that Texas, for years, should secede from the United States, especially now that government has grown in Washington so much larger and more onerous. So they were having a meeting last week, a couple of weeks back. In fact, they were doing it and having a birthday party for a member as well, when suddenly police came barging in. It just knocked down the doors and came in and started arresting people. They were fingerprinting people as well who were there. The reason was because two members of the organization had sent a court summons, and it was not an official summons, to a judge. Now, it's a tongue-in-cheek type of thing, symbolic, but according to law enforcement, that was a violation of the law, so they had to go teach these people a lesson. As I said earlier, if they can no longer use the IRS as a cudgel against you because of the bad publicity, they'll just simply go out and knock your doors down and start hauling you away and taking your fingerprints. And the warrant they had even said they could take the DNA of the people at this meeting. Mike Huckabee is coming up in just a few seconds with the Huckabee Report, brought to you exclusively by the financial advisors at Waddell & Reed in Twin Falls. Telephone number 736-6563. That's 736-6563. Governor Huckabee actually may have a comment or two about the event taking place in Washington right now. Want to thank Governor Huckabee, and of course, again, he was brought to you exclusively by the financial advisors at Waddell & Reed in Twin Falls. Telephone number 736-6563. 954-31 at our studios. News Radio 1310 KLIX, as well as you can hear us anywhere around the world on newsradio1310.com. And you can also give us a shout, too, if you have something that's still on your mind this morning about some of what we discussed. 736-0300. I've got just a couple of minutes to go, but we might be able to squeeze someone in. You can email me as well at bill.colley@townsquaremedia.com. Last name spelled Colley. Benjamin Netanyahu has just wrapped up his remarks before a joint session of Congress. Despite all of the claims by Democrats who were attending, some boycotted the speech, but those who were attending said that they would not be giving him a warm response. Turns out that during his remarks, many of them were also on their feet applauding, and he has now left the room, and they're breaking up, and of course most of the crowd is now on the way out as well. If you had an opportunity to see it, it was great theater, but I think he also made a wonderful pitch when it came to outlining what he really believes is going on in his part of the world, especially dealing with the devil, which is a deal with Iran. I think that he laid out just the history of the terrorism sponsored by that country, the dangers and difficulties of the United States going down this road, allowing Iran eventually to become a nuclear power in that part of the world, would be a very, very dangerous thing. In the Iranian version of Islam, they believe that there is going to be an imam who is born and who will then lead a great holy war, and that will bring about the end of the world. And then with the end of the world, they will all go to paradise. And if their nuclear bomb helps them bring about the end of the world, they're not much more different than ISIS. They just have bigger palaces in Iran. ISIS is living out in the desert or in some of the captured cities, which are pretty much bombed out relics right now. But there's not much difference. One has the veneer of government, the other does not. 9:56, Bill Colley with you on Top Story. Rush Limbaugh coming up in a few minutes. We have a caller with us on News Radio 1310 KLIX. You don't have much time. What's on your mind?
Do you remember Notre Dame's prediction?
I have read about his predictions, and I think they're mainly garbage.
You think they're mainly garbage, but the end of the deal is it says it comes with a guy wearing a blue turban.
Yeah, he also had some predictions. People said he was talking about Adolf Hitler, but it turned out that he was talking about a river in Budapest. When you really go into this, and I think that's been the History Channel made a great deal of money selling advertising on the ratings they got for those types of shows. But I tend to believe that the guy was just writing about events of his day, and it gets interpreted, unfortunately, as being that he was some sort of great prognosticator, that is, seer of events into the future. Lots of people, though, wear turbans, and he could have been referring to somebody, too, at the time who was perhaps running the Caliphate or the Ottoman Empire, which were very, very powerful during the course, anyway, of his lifetime. Coming up on 9:58, and do want to point out Rush Limbaugh will be along with more details and in-depth about the speech by the Israeli Prime Minister. Also, Sean Hannity will do the same thing when he's on the air, just after the 1 o'clock news. And Glenn Beck as well with his analysis after 4 o'clock news today. News from Fox and all of those situations here on News Radio 1310 KLIX and newsradio1310.com. Bill Colley with you this morning on Top Story. God willing and the creek don't rise, I get to do it all over again tomorrow morning at 8 o'clock. Hope you can join us.